On June 30th, 1999, in West Alton, Missouri, a woman was driving along a road near Route 367 where she spotted something in a nearby cornfield, so she stopped, got out of her car, and approached the field, and to her horror, she would discover a body face down in the dirt wearing filthy jeans and a stained shirt, and the body would eventually be determined to be Ricky McCormick's. But it wasn't just the state of his body that would shock and puzzle investigators, it would be what they found in his pockets: crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do to you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freakin'. Today we are talking about a very troubling and puzzling case with a lot of twists and turns and ciphers, so without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go mock fight to the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this troubling case together, alright? Here is the original English text from your transcript, with added punctuation periods, commas, question marks, dashes, quotes, etc. For natural sentence breaks, pauses, unreadability, while keeping every single word and content exactly as provided. No additions, no removals, no rephrasing. On June 30th, 1999, in West Alton, Missouri, a woman was driving along a road near Route 367 when she spotted something in a nearby cornfield, so she stopped, got out of her car, and approached the field, and to her horror, she would discover a body face down in the dirt wearing filthy jeans and a stained shirt, and the body would eventually be determined to be Ricky McCormick's. But it wasn't just the state of his body that would shock and puzzle investigators, it would be what they found in his pockets: crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do to you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freakin'. Today we are talking about a very troubling, unpuzzling case with a lot of twists and turns and ciphers, so without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go mock fight to the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this troubling case together, alright? Let's take a brief moment to talk about something I don't usually talk about, but I actually really love, and that's makeup. Honestly, I used to dread my morning routine. So many products, so many brushes, and somehow I'd still end up looking cucky or just not good. Then I discovered Jones Road Beauty, and everything changed. First of all, their Miracle Balm is honestly incredible. It's a highlighter, bronzer, blush, and lip tint all in one, so no brushes needed. Just dab it on with your finger, blend it for like 10 seconds, and you're done, and it gives you this natural dewy glow that looks like you just a little bit enhanced. But I can literally be out the door in under a minute looking put together. And here's what I really love is that all their formulas are clean and actually good for your skin. Cause I have really sensitive skin, so that matters to me a lot. No phthalates, no sulfates, no junk. It nourishes your skin instead of clogging it. And for a limited time, my listeners get free shimmer face oil with your first purchase when you use code KMK at checkout, so head to Jones Road Beauty. Comment use code KMK, so let them know I sent you, and enjoy your Jones Road Beauty. Thank you so much to Jones Road Beauty for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to it. Ricky McCormick was born on June 14, 1958 in St. Louis, Missouri, to Charles McCormick and Frankie Sparkson. They were a working-class family doing their best to get by, and not much is known about his siblings or the rest of his extended family, but what we do know is that Ricky was very close to his cousin who shared his father's name, Charles McCormick. And the two weren't just cousins, they were practically brothers, spending so much time together that people often mistook them as siblings, but outside that bond. Though Ricky's childhood was difficult, he attended Martin Luther King High School in St. Louis, though attended might be too generous a word, because the school shuffled him from grade to grade despite his continuous struggles, because he couldn't keep up and he couldn't learn the way the other kids did, and eventually he would actually drop out, and by the time he left, Ricky was functionally illiterate, and his father put it bluntly, saying he couldn't spell anything, just scribble. And his mother was even more direct, saying the only thing he could write was his name. So these weren't proud parents by any means, and Ricky knew it, and he never felt particularly close to them. But there were signs even back then that something deeper was going on, and according to his mother, Ricky would spend his free time at recess by himself, just standing there kind of staring off into the distance, and the school obviously would notice, and they would call home to ask if anything was going on out of the ordinary, but it would be determined that everything seemed fine, but at school and at home Ricky would tell strange stories, kind of odd tales that made people uncomfortable, the kind that made everyone around him start to wonder if there was something wrong with this kid. But through all of it, there was one person Ricky could confide in, and that was his Aunt Gloria McCormick, or Cookie for shortened. She was the only one who seemed to really listen to Ricky, but the concerns about Ricky's mental state didn't go away as he got older. If anything, they got worse, and family members kept noticing the same troubling patterns, the way he'd stand alone at recess staring at nothing, the way he'd drift off mid-conversation like he wasn't even their aunt. Eventually, whether from the school's recommendation or the family's own growing worries, they sent him to see a psychiatrist, and the findings were a striking end. According to Aunt Gloria, or Cookie, the psychiatrist described it like Ricky had hit a brick wall in his mind. He was trapped behind it, didn't want to stay there. Didn't want to live the life he was living, but he couldn't or wouldn't break through, and the psychiatrist's explanation was simple, quote, he didn't like the life of living poor and had an active imagination, unquote. So a kid growing up with nothing, dreaming of something better, like escaping into his own head, because reality wasn't offering much, but his family saw it differently. It wasn't just a kid dreaming. His own mother would regularly call Ricky, quote, unquote, retarded. Which, yes, it was much different times back then. But I mean, imagine your own mother calling you that. I mean, yeah, that's not nice. And his cousin Charles noticed it to those, saying Ricky would talk like he, quote unquote, was in another world, like he was somewhere else entirely, even when he was standing right in front of you. So maybe it was just childish imagination that never quite faded, the kind of daydreaming most kids grow out of, but Ricky ever did. Or maybe it was something more serious, like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or something that was never diagnosed and never treated, never even properly explored. And no medical professional ever confirmed anything, but his own family had their suspicions, and those suspicions followed Ricky for the rest of his life. So Ricky McCormick was around 30 years old when he began a relationship with a young girl, not a woman, a girl his family only knew by one name, Pretty Baby. And like I said, she was not a woman, she was a child, and according to court documents, Pretty Baby was younger than 11 years old when the relationship began. 11, a 30-year-old man with an 11 eyes, fucking disgusting us. Oh, Ricky's disgusting, and he's a piece of shit, and this relationship continued for years, and by the time anyone did anything about it, she was 14 years old, and she had already given birth to 2 of Ricky's for children, and the court documents used the nickname Pretty Baby to protect her identity since she was a minor at the time, but the damage was already done. So on November 9th, 1990, Ricky McCormick was arrested, and he was 34 years old at the time, and the charge was first-degree assault. But it didn't stop there. He would also be charged with rape of a child under the age of 14, and his bond would be set at $50,000. So for weeks, he sat waiting for his hearing to be scheduled, and when things finally started moving, the defense threw a wrench into the process, and they filed a motion for psychiatric evaluation. And the claim from his public defender was that Ricky was, quote, suffering from some mental disease or defect, unquote. And on February 11th, 1993, the motion was denied and his hearing was pushed to April 22nd. But this time, the judge granted the request, and Dr. Michael Arbor, a local psychologist, was brought in to evaluate whether Ricky was fit for trial or not. So months would pass, and finally in July, the evaluation would come back that Ricky McCormick was fit to stand trial. And on September 1st, 1993, standing before the court, Ricky pleaded guilty to first-degree assault, so he would be sentenced to 3 years in prison at Farmington Correctional Center. And I think 3 years is way too fucking low, but what do I know, for taking advantage of a kid, my god. And he wouldn't even serve that entire time, cause Ricky McCormick walked out after just 11 to 13 months and released on conditional terms, whatever the fuck that means. So now free Ricky just fell back into the only life that he knew, which at this point, because he got arrested, was all paying jobs like a floor mopper, a dishwasher, a busboy, and eventually he landed a gig as a service station attendant at a Amoco gas station on Chateau Avenue, and these jobs weren't meant to support him entirely. They just filled in the gaps that his disability checks couldn't cover. See, Ricky had chronic heart problems that had plagued him since childhood. Bad enough to qualify for government assistance, but not bad enough to stop him from working the graveyard shift, and his Aunt Gloria called him a vampire and said he preferred the night, heading out at dusk and dragging himself home at dawn, and those late nights would come with habits such as chain smoking, which he started at 10 years old. By the way, that's just different time again. but he would smoke over a pack a day, accompanied by around 20 caffeinated beverages a day. So between the cigarettes and the caffeine and the heart condition he had since birth, it was a miracle he was still standing, but his health would send him to the emergency room more times than anyone could count, and it didn't help that he didn't have a stable home either, because Ricky was known to be a wanderer, or a nomad with no permanent address, and he bounced around the St. Louis area, crashing wherever he could, and sometimes at his elderly mother's house, and sometimes somewhere else entirely, and eventually at the apartment of a woman named Sandra Jones Nouse. And Jones lived in the Clinton Peabody housing projects, just outside of downtown St. Louis, and built in 1940 to Clinton Peabody was the oldest public housing complex in the city, and 358 units spread across 31 buildings, and none of it was maintained well at all, with gaping holes in the walls and mice living in every corner, and the radiators and refrigerators were filled with mold and roaches and bed bugs. The smell alone could drive you out, but for Sandra and eventually Ricky, it was home, and she became an important person in his life, important enough that she'd be one of the last people to speak with him before his death, and important enough that investigators would spend hours picking apart every detail of their final conversations, trying to understand what Ricky was doing in those last days, and trying to figure out who might have wanted him dead. And Sandra would have answers, but not the ones anyone expected. So on June 15th, 1999, Ricky McCormick woke up at the crack of dawn and made his way to the Greyhound bus terminal in downtown St. Louis, where he purchased a one-way ticket to Orlando, Florida. And this wasn't his first trip down south. In fact, he'd already made the journey at least twice that same year, but it's not completely clear who Ricky was meeting in Florida, but phone records painted an interesting picture. So in the weeks leading up to his departure, either he or his girlfriend Sandra Jones had made a flurry of calls to people in the central Florida area, and some of those calls supposedly weren't just to Ricky. So while in Orlando, he checked into room 280 at the Econoline and stayed for 2 days, and during that time he placed a call to the St. Louis gas station where he worked, a call supposedly to his boss. But the question lingered, why was Ricky McCormick making these trips? Because he wasn't the vacation type, and he certainly wasn't dragging Sandra down to Disney World. And according to her, the answer was simple. Ricky would frequently make excursions to Florida to deliver packages, accepting offers to pick up and drop off goods in exchange for cash, and he'd done it several times before. But what was in those packages? Well, marijuana, Sandra would say, because he'd occasionally bring some of it back to their apartment and store it in Ziploc bags and roll it together into bundles as big as a baseball. But when she was asked who the weed belonged to, Ricky told her it was for Baja Hamdullah, his boss at the Amoco station. But after this most recent trip, something was different, and Ricky never talked much about his Orlando runs. But this time he wasn't just quiet, he seemed almost scared. So about a week after returning on the afternoon of June 22nd, 1999, Ricky walked into the emergency room at Barnes Jewish Hospital around 3:00, complaining of chest pains and shortness of breath, and given his history, the years of chain smoking, a pack a day, and enough caffeine to keep a bear awake through hibernation, this wasn't exactly shocking, but doctors would rule out a heart attack, but admitted him anyway, keeping him under observation for a couple of days just to be safe. And then on June 24th, they released him with instructions to return later in the week for a follow-up visit, just to make sure nothing was missed. But he would never make those appointments, and instead of heading home, Ricky hopped on a bus to his Aunt Gloria's apartment, which happened to be just across the street from the hospital, and he was always closer to Gloria than to his mother anyway. And given everything we know about how his parents talked about him, that makes sense. So he would stay at his Aunt Gloria's for about an hour, but something was off. He seemed rushed and anxious, like he needed to be somewhere else, and Gloria offered to drive him wherever he needed to go, but he would decline, and then he left, and that would be the last time and Gloria would ever see him. So the very next day, June 25th, Ricky was back in another emergency room, and this time it was Forest Park Hospital, and once time again, he complained about shortness of breath and wheezing, which he blamed on mowing grass, and the doctors chalked it up to an asthma flare-up and treated him and sent him on his way. But according to Gloria, Ricky didn't actually leave, and he stayed in the hospital waiting room until late into the night, just sitting Or long after he'd been discharged, and looking back, Gloria had a theory about all those hospital visits. She didn't think Ricky was just sick, she thought he was scared because, if you think about it, in the span of 4 days, he checked himself into 2 different emergency rooms, one of which you would stay at into the night after he got discharged, because where would you go if you were afraid for your life? If you knew someone was looking for you, you'd go somewhere. Public, somewhere safe, somewhere with security guards and cameras and witnesses, a hospital, and if your health was already fragile from a lifetime of cigarettes and caffeine, walking in with chest pains wouldn't seem unusual. And also, maybe Ricky wasn't running to the hospitals, maybe he was hiding in them, and when he finally left that waiting room on June 25th, he had nowhere left to hide. And on June 26th, 1999, Ricky called Sandra Jones around 11:30 in the morning, and he told her he was out of the hospital and on his way to a Moco gas station to grab some food, which is a detail later confirmed by an employee who saw him there, and that phone call would be the last conversation Ricky McCormick ever had with anyone that we know of. So no more calls, no more sightings, and no more witnesses. And according to medical examiners, Ricky died just hours later, but his body wouldn't be found for days. So on June 30th, 1909, a woman was driving along a stretch of road near Route 367 in rural St. Charles County when something in a nearby cornfield caught her eye, so she pulled over, got out of the car, and walked closer to get a better look, and what she found horrified her because it was a man lying face down. The dirt, his body already decomposing in the summer heat, so she called authorities immediately, and just like that, the cornfield would become a crime scene. And when investigators arrived, they found a scrawny figure dressed in filthy blue jeans and a stained white t-shirt and a 5'6" frame that had clearly been there for a while, because his face was too deteriorated to even identify, so they'd have to rely on fingerprints, and that's how they confirmed it to be Ricky T. McCormick dead at 41 years old, but the state of his body raised immediate questions, because although he'd only been dead for an estimated 3 to 4 days, the decomposition was far too advanced. His fingertips, for example, had completely rotted off just below the top knuckles and were lying in the weeds beside him, and medical examiners reported that only 72 pounds of bone and flesh remained, and that's not normal, not even for June in Missouri, not even with the heat and the insects. So some investigators began to suspect this wasn't natural decay, and they theorized that whoever killed Ricky might have deliberately kept his body in a high-temperature environment before dumping him, accelerating the decomposition and destroying evidence and covering their tracks. And if that's true, this wasn't just murder, it was calculated and premeditated. It was murder in the first degree. Cause, it seems someone wanted to make sure the cause of death could never be determined, and it worked. And the location itself was significant because this desolate stretch of land between Mississippi and the Missouri rivers had been a dumping ground for bodies for years, which is horrifying to think about. Remind me never to go there, but multiple murder victims over the years had been dropped off in this exact field, so this wasn't a place where people died by accident. And there was another problem: Ricky McCormick didn't own a car, and as you can recall, he relied on public transportation his entire life, constantly going on 2 Greyhound buses, yet there was no bus stop anywhere near where his body was discovered, so someone had definitely driven him there or driven his body there, and the St. Charles County Medical Examiner's Office ruled the cause of death as undetermined. But the story got stranger from there, and some investigators initially claimed Ricky had an injury to his head, only to walk it back the next day, saying the body was too decomposed to make that determination, and they said they couldn't find a motive, and they weren't even sure it was a homicide, yet they weren't reading it like one anyway. And here's the thing that still gets me after reading this case, is that during the entire time Ricky was missing, not a single person reported him gone, not his family, not his job, no one. So maybe they were used to him disappearing for days at a time, or maybe they just didn't think to worry, but I don't think any of them expected him to turn up dead in a cornfield. But the strangest part of his death wasn't how he got there or even the state of his body. It was what investigators found when they searched his pockets, and what they found were the crumpled handwritten notes, covered in incomprehensible jumbled letters. And those notes were taken into FBI custody, and in July 1999, Tom O'Connor, the commander of the Major Case Squad, a statement that would define this case for decades, saying, quote, "We worked every lead and not only can we not prove it, it's a homicide, we can't even come aside, we can't even come up with a motive for this guy to be dead," unquote. They were, strange to say the least, written on 2 sheets of lined paper. It totals more than 30 lines, and they were composed of cryptic blocks and capital letters, numbers, dashes, and parentheses, and the notes were then folded and tucked into Ricky McCormick's pockets, and it was very strange to the untrained eyes. However, to a cryptanalyst, it was code. The letter combinations would appear multiple times throughout the note. The engrams, if you will, they are sequences of words or characters that go in a particular order and to G from the sentence. This is. A sentence would go this is a sentence, which is a bit confusing. I know we're not code crackers here, so I'm not gonna to fully explain it to you. I don't even understand it fully, to be honest, but the engrams and the code DES, EP, RRSC, and DEN, CBE are the most common and repeated patterns in these notes, and there were lots of letter E scattered in both notes, and some segments are circled as well, leading some to believe that it could be a to-do list, with the circle portions being marked as a completed task. And looking at the notes, it doesn't feel like it would be left for investigators to find or left as a code to solve a murder, but instead it seemed like Ricky McCormick wrote it himself as a reminder. And Dan Olson, the chief of the FBI's cryptanalysts on record tearing records unit, would later state that with the amounts of ease in the code, they could be used as a spacer instead of a word. But for nearly 12 years, the case would go cold, with the strange notes hidden from the public eye and sealed away the FBI archives. But finally, the FBI would feel overwhelmed and hit a dead, and even with their best men on the case, completely unable to crack the code. So, before turning to the public, a secret meeting at Niagara Falls would take place, and the FBI wanted their help, and the FBI wanted their help, and the FBI wanted their help. Let's take a brief moment from the video to confess something, and by something I mean not making an appointment when you should. You know that doctor's appointment you've been putting off 4, 5, 6, 7 months, a year. Well, we're not. I'm not doing that anymore, okay? We're using ZOC Doc. Thank you to ZOC Doc. Thank you to ZOC Doc for sponsoring this video. Now, ZOC Doc is a free app and website that helps you find and book high quality and network doctors so you can find someone that you actually love. We're talking over 150,000 providers across all 50 states, from dermatology, dentistry, primary care, you name it, and you could read thousands of the verified patient reviews, see real in time availability, unbook instantly, so no playing phone tag with the doctor's office, and appointments typically happen within 24 to 72 hours, and sometimes even the same day. And I've personally been using ZOC Doc, as you guys know, for over a year now, and it's been a game changer, because finding a doctor I actually used to feel impossible, but now it just takes me minutes. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZOCDoc.com/chem to find and instantly book a doctor you love today. That's ZOCDoc.com/chem. Thank you so much to ZOC Doc for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. So in 2009, the American Cryptography Association gathered for their annual convention in Niagara Falls, Ontario. However, this meeting would be unusual, as the encrypted notes were from a dead man named Ricky McCormick. And when the FBI called the McCormick notes one of the hardest cases they've ever dealt with, up there with the Zodiac Killer, they were not Tiller. Exaggerating. And for reference, the Zodiac sent for Cipher messages to newspapers in 1916, and one was cracked within a week by a husband and wife team in California, but 3 of them remained unsolved for over 50 years, and it wasn't until December of 2020 that a team finally cracked the 340-character cipher. Using modern computing power and over 650,000 hours of calculation, and the other 2 Zodiac ciphers are still unsolved, and the McCormick notes sit right alongside them on the FBI's list of top unsolved ciphers. But the difference is the Zodiac wanted people to try to crack the codes he was taunting them, whereas taunting them, Ricky's notes seemed like they weren't ever meant to be found at all. They were personal and private, and possibly meaningless to anyone but him, which might make them even harder to solve, cause these experts were known for solving cracked codes for fun, solving historical ciphers quicker than some code breakers in history. And from ages 10 to 90, they don't discriminate by age, only by skill, and they read through the McCormick notes using computers and state-of-the-art software to find Any patterns, and 15 to 20 investigators were brought in to crack the code, but all of them failed in the FBI. I was right along there with them, turning to them for help due to their own experts, stumped, because it was a cipher they knew nothing about and they had nowhere to go, not a single step in the right direction. So, if it was Ricky, was it a code that he came up with himself? He may have created his own language and grammar and vocabulary, and on top of that, he could have then turned it into a cipher to further disguise it, so like 2 layers of protection, and that's what makes this code potentially unbreakable. See, most ciphers can be cracked because they follow rules, patterns that repeat, and substitutions that stay consistent, and given enough text, enough time, and enough computing power, patterns start to emerge. But if Ricky created his own personal language, first assigning meaning to letters and symbols that only he understood, and then encrypted that with another layer of coding you need to keys to unlock it, the cipher key and the personal language key, so without which keys, knowing what the underlying language, even as you can't begin to crack the code, it's like trying to translate a foreign language you've never heard of into another foreign language you've also never heard of. If that makes sense, and cryptographers call this an idiosyncratic cipher, a code that exists only in one person's mind. So if Ricky took that knowledge to his grave, the notes might be truly unsolvable, not because they're brilliantly designed necessarily, but because the only decoder is dead. But this seems so advanced, because how could a man like Ricky McCormick, a functionally illiterate man who could barely write his own name, create a code so powerful and secretive that it was stumping investigators and the FBI and even professional code breakers? How is that possible? So with the FBI having nowhere left to turn, it was time to ask the public for help, because for 12 years the FBI's cryptanalysis and DRAC, a tiering records unit, had been studying these notes hoping to crack the code, but the team was stuck learning nothing after years and years of analysis, and for those 12 years the public knew nothing about these notes, and the FBI was just sitting on the code. But these notes could be the key to his mysterious death, and according to FBI laboratory examination documents, items and documents were exchanged frequently about the case, and new evidence was submitted undated to the folder of documents. But seemingly they were hitting bumps and names aren't shown, but new people were taking a crack at the code yearly. On an attempt in December of 2010 stated that all attempts to decipher the symbols were unsuccessful, and one message was when evidence was exchanged in November of 2001 they delayed it indefinitely, stating that due to the terrorist incidents in New York City, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, they would not be examining this new evidence. And finally, on March 29th, 2011, the FBI did something very strange. They asked for help, and Dan Olson, chief of the Bureau's cryptanalysis and racketeering records unit, disclosed the existence of the 2 pages of written encrypted notes found in the pocket of Ricky McCormick's jeans. And finally, since the case had gone cold, the FBI officially stated that Ricky McCormick had been murdered, and according to documents, examiners surmised that he was killed by a cut to his throat. But here's where things get a little bit murky. The FBI documents that were eventually released through the Freedom of Information requests paint a complicated picture. Cause on one hand, they maintain the cause of death was undetermined, but on the other, internal documents suggest examiners believed Ricky was killed by a cut to his throat. So these two things seem contradictory. How can you determine the cause of death but also suspect he was killed by a throat wound? It's just that's 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3, you know what I mean? But the answer probably lies in the decomposition. Cause medical examiners might have seen evidence suggesting trauma to the neck, but with the body so badly decayed they couldn't definitively prove it wasn't caused by something else like decomposition or animals. The fall when his body was dumped, etc. So officially undetermined, and officially they had their suspicions, and when the FBI finally went public in 2011, they made one thing clear: Ricky McCormick had been murdered, and the undetermined cause of death didn't mean natural causes, so it meant someone had successfully hidden how they did it. And according to Olson, the experts had used a variety of advanced techniques, but despite that, standard routes of cryptanalysis seems to have hit a brick wall, unquote. So to cover the FBI's tail, just in case some super genius figured out the code in weeks, he stated that his team are really good at what we do, but we could use some help with this one. Can't admit to just being like, hey guys, we need help, like we probably already are super close to cracking it, but like I guess we'll let you guys look at it to just in case. But if you crack it like we were already closer, this guy solved it, this guy, and the FBI solved it. Swallow your pride, FBI. but he would ask the public to look at. These notes with a fresh pair of eyes and that any details concerning cracking the case would be very helpful because his coding system, as we know, was so hard to crack, so if anyone could just crack a small piece of it, the FBI would greatly appreciate the help, but there was no promise of reward or glory. They hoped that the challenge would suffice enough. Yes, bunch cheapskates basically is what I'm hearing, but no matter what the note says, according to den Olsen quote, even if we found out that he was writing a grocery list or a love letter, we would still want to see how the code is solved. This is a Cipher system we know nothing about, unquote, and the responses were overwhelming, so much so that the FBI had asked people not to call by phone or send any emails, and they instead created a separate page for the public to have access to in order to upload their evidence or theories, and over 7,000 public comments and theories had poured in with tons of theories of what the notes could mean. However, there was one woman who was known for code breaking, someone who was very famous. Center Alon Cod Unin now a Lanka is an expert amateur cryptographer, the person who has consulted Dan Brown and Brown, who wrote the lost symbol in the Da Vinci Code. Yeah, but despite this, she was like everyone else and would only learn after the FBI brought this forward publicly. But Alon Kadanen has some experience with ciphers, having co-authored a book called Code Breaking, a practical guide, and best of all, she had a bit of interest in the Ricky McCormick case to start with, especially since his body was found pretty close to where she lived, and she described the note as something that wasn't random, chicken scratch, but methodical, and throughout saying, quote, "It feels to me that there is an actual rhythm to it, that there's something that's being communicated, that it's not just random letters being written by someone who is schizophrenic and writing odd characters," unquote. She, however, agreed with the findings of others, stating that it wasn't meant for others to see, it was a personal note, so her theory was good, and other people had commonly agreed on at least two basic theories as to who wrote the note. Theory 1 being Ricky wrote the notes, and according to FBI cryptanalyst den Olsen, he had stated he believed Ricky wrote the notes, inquiring that they are, quote, done in more of a format of something written to oneself than something written to someone else, unquote, and the fact that there were circles on the page could imply that Ricky was checking off or selecting things in the to-do list of places he was meant to visit and items he was supposed to pick up maybe, and according to some sources who talked to his family, they described that he would sometimes write in code, and the investigator came to the conclusion that it was probably some personal diary writing, so maybe he just did it for fun, and the FBI is just like ripping their hair out for 12 years being like, what the fuck is it, and he's just like 12 cans of beans, 1 jug of milk, 12 pack of diaper, visit Aunt Gloria and infuriate the FBI. I don't know, but like kids, for example, they make up code names or code things or like secret languages all the time, but for a man who could barely read or write for that matter, maybe this made it easier for him to write things when it's stuff he made up, and also he was in his 42nd. I wouldn't be surprised that he was abbreviating words that he didn't know how to spell other than the first 2 letters. In theory, this seems less possible in my personal opinion, but it is still plausible, and in 2012, which was 13 years after Ricky had passed, his family stated there was no chance Ricky wrote those notes. His mother could not believe in any world that Ricky, the son who could barely read or write, nearly read, illiterate, had written a code so difficult the FBI couldn't figure it out, which I mean that I feel like it could just be gibberish that he just made up to make sense in his own head because he didn't know how to write properly. I don't think that that's out of the realm of possibility. I think she needs to broaden her mind a little bit, but I digress. The only thing she knew he could write was his own name, saying that after 12 years they came back with, quote, unquote, this chicken scratch, and even his cousin Charles stated, quote, he didn't write in no code, done, quote, and that he, quote, couldn't spell anything, just scribble, unquote, and his mother was upset, stating, quote, they told us the only thing in his pockets was the emergency room ticket. Now, well, years later, they come back with this chicken scratch shit, unquote, which, I feel like the family would have been the people you absolutely tell. Like, why are you waiting 12 years to tell them what's happening? Unlike they could have said, oh yeah, that's this, that doesn't make any sense to me. But I digress again, but worst of all, not only did they have to wait 12 years to hear about it, they didn't even hear it from the FBI. They had to hear it on a local evening news broadcast report. I can't even imagine learning news about your son's death 12 years later and not even hearing it from the government or the authorities, but from a late night news broadcast. It's just that sickening. But then again, his mother did not seem to have the best relationship with him, but still I mean they're next of kin, so it's just odd to me. So there are multiple theories, but Ricky couldn't be a mastermind code maker. An illiterate at the same time and day length, a Don in the master code breaker, also stated that knowing more about his background, she believed that he wasn't the mastermind behind the note, but quote, perhaps he was the courier, unquote. But why would Ricky McCormick be delivering a coded letter, and what type of trouble did Ricky put himself into, and who could the letter be for? Well, there are a few alleged suspects people have brainstormed over the years, but just to set the scene, set the tone, get all the facts out there, none of this information I'm about to state was linked legally to the death of Ricky McCormick, just in case anyone was looking to sue. All right, haha, I'm covered anyway. Gregory Lamar Knox was a major drug dealer who operated in the area and underground Clinton Peabody housing complex where McCormick and his girlfriends, Edward Jones, lived. People either knew who he was, or they worked for him, or they ignored him, or they feared him. And according to a March 2001 HUD report which made it to Congress, evidently enough, Knox was a suspect in quote at least a murder for hire schemes, unquote. And according to police records in the LaSalle Park homes, another area he operated out of, he was the one supplier of narcotics. So this guy was known to deal in these areas and was friends with Ricky McCormick, or at least acquaintances. And according to police records, a confidential informant told police that Knox was responsible for the murder of a black man who worked at a gas station on Chateau Avenue, very similar to Ricky McCormick, and supposedly he dumped the body near West Alton. Now, this could totally be a coincidence. Gregory was not a good man, so it could be anyone's body that was dumped. However, Ricky McCormick was a black man who worked at a gas station on Chateau Avenue, and his body was found there. Too coincidence maybe, or at least the police assumed so, but somehow investigators couldn't make the connection stick, and Detective Yarbrough would later say the claims, quote unquote, could not be substantiated. And Knox, for his part, claimed total ignorance, quote, this is all new information to me, unquote. He would write from prison, end quote, I have no information that could help your case, unquote, the perfect non-answer. So Detective Yarbrough stated that despite ongoing suspicions, these claims could not be substantiated, unlink a connection between Knox and McCormick's death, despite the confidential informant claims. And I'm no expert in the justice system, but to really say there isn't a hard link between the informant claims and his suspicious response, I just feel like that shouldn't have been a dead end. But what do I know? I'm just a YouTuber. But it wasn't exactly a dead end. There were other people involved in the case that could be linked to McCormick's death, and one of them was named Baha Hamtal. Let's take a moment to talk about something I've learned about breaking bad habits. Trying to just stop doing something doesn't necessarily work. Sometimes you need to replace it to help with it. And that's exactly why fume exists, because fume, spelled FM, is a flavored dare device designed to help people quit vaping and smoking by replacing the hand-to-mouth habit. So no nicotine, no vapor, and no batteries. Just a weighted fidget-friendly tool with natural flavors that gives your hands something better to reach for when your cravings hit. I personally keep mine on my desk, and honestly, I reach for it constantly. Cause I'm just a fidget person, honestly, and the crisp mint, it hasn't always will be my favorite flavor. I think it's just become a part of my regular routine, and I have family members that use fume now instead of smoking, and I'm very happy about that, cause I want them to be around for a very long time, happy and healthy, and fume has already helped over 700,000 people take steps toward better habits, and now it's your turn, so head to try fume. Calm that steer yfum.com and use code CCCM to get your free gift with your journey pack. That's try fume. Calm with code CCM to claim your free gift today. Thank you so much to Fume for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. And let's get back to it. Juma Hamdallah was the owner of the AIM Alco gas station of which Ricky worked at, and he took over the store when the previous owner F.A. was Hamdan killed an neighbor with a butcher knife in May of 1990 for what's going on in this town, but he would later die in prison, but I digress. So an incident would happen between Juma, the store owner, and his brother Baha. So Juma employed his brother Baha, and you'd think that with the familial ties they wouldn't fight, but this family's fights with each other sometimes led to death, it turns out, because there was an incident in August of 1999, only 2 months after the death of Ricky McCormick, and police from Maryland Heights were investigating an incident involving Juma, who allegedly claimed to Juma had shot his Brother Baha Baha survived the attack and filed no charges. However, they linked the incident to possibly being attributed to Baha's involvement with black gang members in St. Louis City and narcotics use, unquote, and this means they were involved with criminal activity and the police knew, especially with Baha's extensive violence and possession of firearms and knives. And now that you know the family, or at least Juma, you're now ready for Baha, his brother. Okay, now the information here is a bit murky, but I'm going to reference the most reliable sources. So Baha Hamdallah was employed at the same Amoco gas station on Chateau Avenue and had a history of violence, and tons of other sources say that he was Ricky's boss, but I'm not 100% positive on that. But regardless, they worked together for sure. But anyway, Baha Hamdallah had moved to St. Louis in 1997 from Cleveland, Ohio, and at 22 years old, he was cruising around in his blue Mazda protege when a police detective watched him pull alongside another man, and this man was named Terrence Clark, and he watched Baha lean out of his car window and fire a shot at him with a .38 caliber revolver, and missing, he drove off Clark, escaping unarmed, and Baha would be arrested but somehow was never charged. So violent man who attempted murder was still walking the streets completely fine, and I'm not sure what the hell is going on with the police in the 90 seconds in Missouri. But my God, but only 9 months later, on March 4th, 1998, Baha would get into an argument with one of his brothers named B.A. Hot Hamdallah. Now B.A. Hot worked at the Family Market, a small corner grocery store in the Tower Grove East neighborhood, and the argument would then lead to an alleged gunshot from Baha, who allegedly shot at B.I.J. Ott from across the street, and the bullet tore through the left side of B.I.J. Ott's abdomen and knocked him to the ground, with Baha speeding off in his car once again, and for some odd reason B.I.J. Ott also bleeding. Did not press charges. This family doesn't hold grudges or something. It's kind of crazy, but it doesn't matter if someone presses charges or not. This charge is still a crime, you know. However, Bajo T completely flipped the investigation, cause Bajo T described to the police that he had never seen the man who shot him before, and instead described a TD Hispanic man instead of his 5'10", 225-pound Middle Eastern brother. And 6 days later, Baha Hamdallah turned himself in and was arrested on a felony charge of first-degree assault, but because Baha did not press charges, there are no records of this case. It's but make it makes sense, cause how can you shoot a gun at another person twice and still not see the inside of a prison cell? I don't understand it. Also, even if you shoot someone and they don't press charges, it's legal now. Is that we can do that? I don't want it, but you know what, but none of this lines up with the law. But according to the sources, it just states that this incident never happened since there was no charges, but this wouldn't be the only incident, cause Baha would do it again in the same month, and while working at the Amoco station, the same station where Ricky worked, Baha would be arrested on a felony charge of second-degree assault. Why, you ask? Well, he tried to kill someone with a hammer. This time he downgraded from a gun to a hammer, and the man he supposedly tried to kill was named Elroy Carr, and he allegedly did it with a rusty hammer, and he then told police, quote, "I just figure I take care of this myself," unquote. However, to no surprise, on August 7th, 1998, just 2 weeks before the court case with Carr was going to go to court, Carr was killed, and he was gunned down just a few blocks from the Amoco station, and those assault charges went out the window with them. So Carr's murder was never solved, and the police made no arrests despite informants stating that Carr was killed at the behest of Baha Hamdallah, unquote. But I digress to repeat myself. Ricky McCormick then died on June 27th, 1999. So with this connections, Amber Jones, Ricky's girlfriend, told police and investigators that Ricky had mentioned he was holding marijuana for Baha Hamdallah, and even believed that the trip down to Florida was for Baha. So obviously police looked into this matter and watched Baha Hamdallah's takeout surveillance investigations, but nothing stuck, and they couldn't prove that Baha Hamdallah was involved. But Baha would slip up and would finally have justice served against him, because on October 13th, 2000, about a year later, Baha was working at Charlie's Food Market in Madison, Illinois, and he then got into an argument with a customer named Robert Stepped Owen. Details are a little bit fuzzy here, but the one we'll go with was that there was a fight for the pistol outside of the store, where Baha then shot stepped in the face, and with luckily there being a bunch of witnesses, he would be arrested, charged, and found guilty in front of a jury and sentenced to 38 years in prison in September of 2000. To now that murder was obviously Baha, he shot a man point blank in the face. However, in May of 2006 in the East Illinois court, Hamdalla's lawyer made a mistake and didn't call a gunshot residue expert to testify in prison, and because of this, the court offered a retrial of the case. So with the second go-around, the jury somehow bought the claim of self-defense, stating his version that the gun went off during the struggle for control over the pistol between the two. This is the luckiest human being I've ever heard of. So on May 15, 2008, Hamdallah walked out of the court a free man, and now that he is a free man and no one really knows details about him anymore, but I'm telling you now, watch out for Baha Hamdallah with the Hamdallah fuck with attempts to contact them being unsuccessful by reporters. He lives out his life supposedly in the Cleveland area, attempting to restart his life again. So just to recap, men who were possibly involved in the murder of Ricky McCormick now walk free or have no input in his death, and there are still no answers for these men, and although the involvement may seem obvious, the law turns a blind eye and has no connection with them. So with theories still swarming around, people believed to have found connections or even solutions to his murder, and even better, some people think they know what the notes say, and people had tons of theories about the notes with different ideas and situations that could have caused the note to be created, and we're going to go over a few that I think are the most important and most plausible. And first is the courier theory, and this was a theory that was under Alan Cawdon's hypothesis, where she stated that the note was either written by Ricky or someone else meant to carry a message related to his drug running. So let's say it wasn't Ricky, this would be a code that was used to inform fellow people in the drug trade, while Ricky was only meant to deliver the message alongside the drugs, and this code is called Idioglossai, which is just a language spoken by two people, and the language could be so basic if you have the notes to translate them. For example, if I say, read is the word parallelogrammar, you have no idea if that is the translation, unless you knew the code ahead of time. It's just completely made up and completely random, basically, but basically without the cheat sheet you cannot solve it, it's impossible. But this could be the case with the drug dealers, pretending they were James Bond with fucking secret codes, being among the few who knew the codes, and if this is true, we will never ever know the translation. However, if this is Ricky's own version as well, we'll never know either, and this unfortunately is the most tragic theory, and I hope it's not the actual answer, because then there's no way anyone will ever be able to solve this unsolved the way Ricky died. But the next theory is medical records, and this theory plays both sides, stating that it was either written by Ricky or a nurse, and the theory is that the note is about medical records from the hospital he visited, specifically the Barnes Jewish Hospital. Firstly, if a nurse wrote this, people thought they could be abbreviating or using a version of their own shorthand. Doctors have a shorthand that is very confusing, but a nurse learning might instead abbreviate to help them remember what to inform other nurses or the doctor of aid. And one Reddit user's theory suggested what each word or combination of letters could be describing, and it's very convincing and honestly really well throughout. Like a Ls-P or PPITXLYPP, IYNCBE and so on are all procedures patient priority intake. An X-ray priority not covered by insurance, and magnesium within limits to find receive nurse procedure. So when you really look at it, you can kind of see where their thought process was, especially if it has to do with the checkup at the hospital and theories surrounding the shorthand. But something possibly even more believable is Ricky using shorthand instead, as he knew letters and could spell his name at the very least. So maybe he knew enough to abbreviate words with letters instead, and the Reddit user covers the entire thing, and I'll show it on screen obviously. But this seems like a very plausible outcome for his notes, because he struggled badly with dyslexia and was borderline illiterate, and in the notes the words are words completely jumbled, and the one of the lines looks like it could be a phone number even on this portion of the words. When you turn your head to the left side, look like they read 362, and when people search this number with the 36 to prefix, they found it attributed to the Barnes Jewish Hospital, which treated him, which is very interesting. And there are some other quickfire theories that also exist on the internet that were just short little ideas like VIN numbers for cars that Ricky would work on at the gas stations and electrical components, serial numbers and medication reminders and addresses, directions. Street names are abbreviated beyond recognition in gambling books and debts for bookies. And lastly, the worst guess, in my opinion, written by aliens. But maybe not, I don't know, anything goes at this point. But unfortunately, with all of these ideas and all of these theories over decades of guesses and suggestions of code, cracking no one is closer and no one has solved it, and the notes to this day are unsolved, and Ricky's cause of death is still undetermined, although the FBI has confirmed it was murder, but they can't begin to point fingers at who is truly responsible. But he would be found 15 miles from where he lived in a remote cornfield with no bus stops, no public transit, nothing. Cause Ricky didn't own a car and couldn't drive, so how did he get there? Someone had to have driven him or driven his body and died out. Authorities are searching as hard as they were in the early too, but they're still open to suggestions if anyone ever gets close, so feel free to try to crack the code. But Ricky McCormick's death continues to confuse investigators and internet theorists to this day with a cipher that could be so advanced it rivals the Zodiac, a grocery list for picking up drugs, or a nurse's shorthand. We'll never know, but I'm curious to know your thoughts. That is the case of Ricky McCormick. It's very puzzling, untroubling, and confusing, and I did not forget that he did what he did to that kid, so I'm due. I hope the family at least gets justice. Yes, do I think he should have been walking free? No, you know. But I'm here to tell you the facts of this case, cause the whole Cipher thing is very intriguing and very, very puzzling. So let me know what you guys think down below. Let me know what other cases you want me to deep dive into, and I will see you in the next one. Okay, stay safe out there. Bye bye.